Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful day at ASBN Live. I'm Felicity Sivalingam, the Programming and Events Manager here at the American Sustainable Business Network, and we're honored to have SEC's Director, Renee Jones, speaking on climate-related disclosures for investors. It's now my pleasure to bring on ASBN's own Ali Reza Vahabzadeh to introduce Director Jones.
Thank you so much, Tulasi. Welcome, everybody. Great to see you all. I'm Ali Reza Vahabzadeh, Executive Vice President, Head of Membership, Chief of Staff, and ESG Policy Co-Lead at the American Sustainable Business Network. I'm coming to you live today from the home of Muhammad Ali and one of our newest association members, Canopy, in Louisville, Kentucky, where I'm joining our CEO, Jeffrey Hollander, for Canopy's Good Business Summit. On behalf of ASBN, we are thrilled to welcome you to today's webinar to discuss the Securities and Exchange Commission's recent proposal, which was released on March 21st on the enhancement and standardization of climate-related disclosures, Ms. Renee Jones, who serves as Director, Division of Corporation Finance at the SEC. For those who are not familiar with the American Sustainable Business Network, or ASBN is a movement builder in partnership with the business and investor community. ASBN develops and advocates solutions for policymakers, business leaders, and investors that support an equitable, regenerative, and just economy that benefits all, people and planet. As a multi-issue membership organization advocating on behalf of every business sector, size, and geography, ASBN and its association members collectively represent over 250,000 businesses across our networks. ASBN was founded through the merger of the American Sustainable Business Council and Social Venture Circle. Last year, ASBN launched a corporate transparency and ESG disclosure working group, and we encourage all who are interested to join. Through this working group, ASBN has been working to address serious and growing concerns about business activities which are unaccounted for, or currently escape disclosure as negative externalities, which at this point also do not affect the P&L or balance sheets of corporations. These negative externalities are effectively unaccounted for in today's accounting requirements, leading to a massive blind spot for businesses and investors as to the real impact of the contribution of businesses to the climate crisis. ASBN has also developed a sign-on statement to support the SEC climate disclosure proposal, where you can go ahead and take impactful action to support the proposal and add comments. We will also be issuing our own official comment to the SEC regarding the proposal and encourage all who wish to participate in the ASBN comment to please get in touch. ASBN believes the enhancement and standardization of climate-related disclosures is overdue and urgently needed to help investors and American businesses compete effectively in an economy that needs to move faster than it is today towards decarbonization. Under today's governance, business and investors working to decrease or eliminate their impact on the climate crisis do not have a level playing field when it comes to reporting and assessing climate-related topics and validating suitable investment choices. Investors and business owners, and consequently their impact on the climate crisis, will benefit from greater transparency and accountability proposed by the SEC. As we begin, we'd like to thank Director Jones and her colleagues at the SEC for introducing and championing the proposal on the enhancement and standardization of climate-related disclosures. I'm honored to have the privilege of introducing Director Renee Jones. Ms. Renee Jones is the Director of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission's Division of Corporation Finance. Prior to joining the Commission staff in 2021, Director Jones served as Professor of Law and Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at Boston College Law School, where she taught and wrote in the areas of corporate law, securities law, and corporate governance. Previously, she represented private and public companies on corporate and securities matters at the law firm Hill & Barlow. Director Jones is a member of the American Law Institute and has served as co-chair of the Securities Law Committee of the Boston Bar Association. She received her undergraduate degree from Princeton University and her law degree from Harvard Law School. Thank you for being with us today, Director Jones. ASBN is so excited to have you join us to share your thoughts and perspective on the SEC's climate-related disclosures proposal. By way of format, we appreciate you sharing your insights with us on the background, reason, and necessity for this proposal and its implications going forward. We'll then turn to our Q&A as we have so many questions that have been submitted so we can better understand the proposal and support this landmark regulation that the SEC is proposing. I would like to hand the virtual floor to our esteemed guest. Director Jones, please take it away.
Thank you so much, AR, for that nice introduction, and it's really great to be here today. Before I start, I'll briefly note that my remarks today represent my own views and are not necessarily those of the Commission or its staff. So before we get into Q&A, as you mentioned, I'm going to give a brief overview of why the Commission proposed the disclosure rule, the climate disclosure rule, and also what's in the proposal. So first, the reasons for the rule. The proposed rules seek to provide investors with information about climate-related risks and opportunities. So this simple statement can be unpacked into 5 main points that I would like to underscore. First, the rule focuses on investors' need for information. Second, the rule focuses on risks or adverse events that may occur in the future. Investors care about risks because they care about future performance in addition to a company's past financial results. The Commission has for decades required disclosures to inform investors about risks, including disclosure about risk factors and management discussion and analysis in a company's Form 10-K. The Commission has also required disclosures regarding a company's environmental risks for several decades. So climate-related disclosures are therefore consistent with the SEC's disclosure mandate and with its longstanding practice. For example, back in 2010, the Commission published guidance about how the Commission's rules may require disclosure about the impacts of climate change on a company's business or financial condition. As climate-related impacts have become more well-documented, awareness of these risks to businesses and the economy has grown, and therefore investor demand for climate-related information has also grown. And investors want information about the effects of the climate on a company's business and about how a company is addressing climate-related risks. And more specifically, investors want information about how management assesses and responds to these risks. Yeah. Can you hear me? I just want to make sure this is good. The audio is good. All right, sorry. I'll keep going. Although many companies have begun to provide some of this information voluntarily, much of this disclosure is occurring outside of Commission filings under different third-party frameworks and at various levels of completeness. So we're concerned that the existing disclosure of climate-related risks do not provide investors with a consistent, comparable, and reliable climate-related information that they need to make informed investment and voting decisions. And the proposed rules are intended to fill this void. So now I'd like to touch on some of the main components of the proposal, what's in the proposals. The first set of requirements would bring consistency and comparability to disclosures about a company's strategy, governance, risk management, and metrics with respect to climate-related risks. Building on the TCFD framework, these proposed rules would require disclosures about physical risks, such as relocating facilities due to rising sea levels. The rules would also require disclosure about transition risks, which may relate to new regulatory standards, evolving technological standards, and changing consumer, counterparty, and investor preferences. Finally, the proposed rule would require companies to disclose the actual and potential impact of climate risks on their strategy, business model, and outlook. With respect to risk management and strategy, a second set of disclosure requirements would apply to companies that use targets, transition plans, scenario analysis, or carbon pricing as part of their risk management process. Companies that have set targets would be required to disclose their plans to achieve those targets. Companies that have transition plans, similarly, would have to provide disclosure about those plans. And companies that use scenario analysis or internal carbon pricing as part of their risk management strategies would need to disclose information about that too. And all of these disclosures would be standardized so that they're more complete, comparable, and decision useful to investors. Importantly, the proposed rules would not require companies that do not have targets or transition plans, scenario analysis, or internal carbon pricing to provide these disclosures. With respect to financial metrics, the proposed rules would require companies to disclose certain information in their notes to the financial statements. Financial metrics disclosure would include the financial impact of climate-related events, such as severe weather events, flooding, droughts, or wildfires, and transition activities on financial statement line items on a line-by-line basis. The disclosure of these financial impacts would be triggered if the amount is 1% or more of the related line item. Companies would also have to disclose on a line item basis their expenditures related to mitigating the risk of severe weather events and transition activities. For example, the cost of retiring assets or relocating assets or operations due to climate risks. Companies would be required to separately aggregate these expenditures or capital costs that are incurred, and these expenditure metrics would also be subject to the same 1% threshold as the financial impact metrics. So these disclosures would go to current costs that companies are incurring as opposed to future risks. Now, with respect to GHG emissions, the proposal would require disclosure of these greenhouse gas emissions, which increasingly are being used as a metric to assess a company's exposure and the potential financial impact of climate-related transition risks. All companies would be required to disclose their Scope 1 and Scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions. These are emissions that result directly or indirectly from facilities or activities controlled by a registrant. Some companies would also be required to disclose Scope 3 emissions, and these are emissions from upstream or downstream activities in a company's value chain. The Scope 3 disclosure would be required if the Scope 3 emissions are material to investors, or if the company has made a commitment that includes a Scope 3 emissions reduction target. Attestation. We recognize that the proposed GHG emissions disclosures will have to be reliable if they're going to be useful to investors. So to that end, larger companies would be required to include in their filings an attestation report that covers the disclosure of their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. Now, this attestation report would not have to be provided by a PCAOB registered accountant. It could, for example, be provided by an engineering firm. But the assurance provider must use standards that are publicly available and that are established by a body or a group that has followed due process procedures. And the assurance provider must also be independent of management. So we want to make sure that this proposal works for investors and also for companies. And the proposal includes a number of accommodations which aim to ease the transition for companies and also to allay concerns that were expressed regarding the liability risks that are associated with these climate-related disclosures. So I'm going to address a few of those accommodations here. I'll start with the liability safe harbors. To the extent that the proposed disclosures include forward-looking information, for example, scenario analysis, transition plans, internal carbon pricing, the PSLRA safe harbor for forward-looking statements would apply, assuming that its conditions are met. In addition, the proposed rules include a new liability safe harbor that would be available for Scope 3 disclosures, if these disclosures are made with a reasonable basis and the disclosures are made in good faith. With respect to estimates, the Commission has recognized that GHG methodologies are still evolving, and companies would be allowed to use reasonable estimates when providing their GHG emissions disclosure, as long as they describe the assumptions that are underlying these estimates and the reasons for using them. If there are gaps in data that are required to calculate GHG emissions, a company has to disclose how it chose to fill those gaps and the impact of that method on those estimates. There are also phase-in periods for these disclosure requirements based on an issuer's size. And there's a longer phase-in period for Scope 3 emissions disclosure and for the attestation requirements for Scopes 1 and 2 for those companies to which it will apply. Non-accelerated filers will not be subject to the attestation requirements, and furthermore, smaller reporting companies would be exempt from Scope 3 emissions reporting requirements. So what's next? Well, the ball is now in your court. and we hope you will comment on all aspects of the rule, both the high-profile issues and the important but less widely discussed issues. In fact, we hope that all questions that we pose in the release will receive comments from a diverse group of stakeholders. Thank you again for inviting me, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you, Director Jones, for sharing your thoughts and insightful comments with us. We'll now move to the Q&A of our programming. We have quite a few questions that have been submitted in advance that we'd like to cover, and hopefully we'll get through all of them. Let's start with our member questions. Tim Greiner, Managing Director of Pure Strategies, a certified B Corporation, asks, given the risks that climate change poses to public companies, why is the SEC not requiring Scope 3 targets, projected emissions of firms which have not set targets? As of June 2021, only 24% of companies in the S&P 500 index participated in the Science-Based Targets Initiative, SBTI, and only 16% of index emissions were covered by SBTs. What is the Commission's view on ensuring shareholders should have more information regarding Scope 3 emissions reduction efforts, i.e. goals in progress, from a much broader set of companies?
So with respect to disclosure of targets, scenario analysis, and transition plans and things like that, we really are trying to balance the investor's need for information with the compliance costs. And it may be that the companies that are already disclosing this information or using those tools, those risk management tools, are those for which those tools are the most valuable. So we're a disclosure-based agency. So if a company is using these risk management tools, scenario analysis, Scope 3 targets, including Scope 3 targets, we're requiring them to disclose that and disclose important information surrounding that. But in terms of balancing, like I said, investors' need for information with compliance costs, the determination was made to require those disclosures if companies are using those, but not to mandate the use of these targets.
Thank you.
Sure.
The next question comes from Natasha Land, Managing Partner and Portfolio Manager at Arjuna Capital. Her question is, the proposal leaves it to registrants to determine if their Scope 3 emissions are material and therefore need to be disclosed. Can you please provide some examples of how a company might determine whether Scope 3 is material and what recourse there is if the SEC or investors disagree with such a determination?
Sure, thank you for that question. It's a question that we're hearing a lot. I think I'll start off by saying that when we talk about materiality, we are incorporating the materiality standard that the Supreme Court has announced and that the Commission has applied for many years. And the materiality determination is based on whether information would be important to a reasonable investor when making an investment or voting decision. So that materiality determination is something that companies are used to making and that the SEC is also, and courts are also used to evaluating. So when we talk about materiality, we're incorporating what is hopefully a familiar concept to investors, to companies, to the SEC, and to the court. So I'll start with that. Now, with respect to determining the materiality of Scope 3 emissions, we have some, I think, important and helpful guidance in the release. And so I would encourage people who have this question to refer to the release. I know it's a very long release, but there's a useful table of contents. So that will help you find the information that I'm talking about. So basically, there's just some examples in the release as to when Scope 3 emissions would be material. That is when it would be important to investors. I think I would start off by saying that the release notes that Scope 3 emissions for many companies and in many industries, Scope 3 emissions are the vast majority of their GHG emissions. So to the extent that the Scope 3 emissions are the most significant part of the GHG emissions, it's more likely to be material or important to investors as they're making an assessment of the possible risks related to transition to a lower carbon economy. Other circumstances that are discussed in the release where Scope 3 emissions might be material is if the company has significant sources of funding that are subject to the financial institutions or the investors' efforts to reduce its carbon footprint. The companies are operating in jurisdictions where there are emission reduction commitments and if the companies are operating in industries where there is already a transition underway. So there's some, again, some examples in the release, and one of the examples, for example, is the auto industry or auto manufacturing industry, where we're already seeing a transition to emission reduction requirements, and also transitions to greater consumer demand for electric vehicles, for example. So those are some areas where Scope 3 emissions are going to be very significant to investors. And again, companies are going to have to make that determination for themselves, but those are the circumstances where the SEC is saying that it's more likely that the Scope 3 would be material in those contexts. Now, with respect to the second question, which I think was about what if the disclosures aren't accurate, or what if they're not providing the disclosure? Yeah, so with respect to that, I would say, we have an annual review program in the SEC, in the Division of Corporation Finance, and we do regularly review companies' filings and their annual reports. And if in the course of our reviews, we have questions about the adequacy of the disclosure, we will provide comments to the issuer. And depending on the response to those comments, if necessary, we could, and sometimes do, make referrals to enforcement. So obviously there's companies are responsible for the completeness and the accuracy of the disclosure. So if there are concerns that the disclosures are misleading or incomplete, there's always the possibility of a referral to enforcement, and they would then investigate the facts.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Our next question comes from Francisco Benedito, the CEO of Climaterelated, and he asks, why does the rule include a transition period? When can we expect to see these disclosure requirements extended to the rest of US companies? Okay,
so those are two questions. Transition, I talked in my prepared remarks, in my introductory remarks, I talked about the need for accommodation, the need to provide time for companies to prepare to provide these disclosures. And so the rule has a transition period that will start with the larger companies having to comply with the disclosure requirements, and then smaller companies would be their disclosure obligations would be phased in over time. So that would give the larger companies, and many larger companies are already familiar with these frameworks, the TCFD framework and the GHG emissions framework, and are already preparing these types of reports. So they're more prepared, basically, to comply with these proposed requirements. And then as those companies and the practices become more developed, then the smaller companies will be able to benefit from the experience of the first companies that comply with those provisions. So that's just with respect to giving companies time to get their disclosure processes and methodologies in place, so that when they do start to make those disclosures are reasonably reliable for investors. With respect to GHG emissions and GHG, especially Scope 3 disclosure, the Commission recognizes that the GHG emissions methodology is less well developed than Scopes 1 and 2. The Commission recognizes that companies that, in preparing their Scope 3 emissions disclosure to a large extent, are relying on third-party data. They may have trouble acquiring that data. They may have to rely on estimates, or there'll be data gaps. So again, we want to make sure that companies have time to prepare and to adjust to these disclosure requirements, and that when they do start providing this disclosure, that it's reliable and accurate. So that was the first part of the question. I think there was a second part of the question.
Yes, the second part of the question was, when can we expect to see these disclosure requirements extended to the rest of US companies?
Okay, that's a good question. Thank you for that question. These disclosure requirements, the disclosure requirements included in the proposal apply to registrants. So those are companies that are filing registration statements with the SEC, or that are filing their annual reports with the SEC. So as proposed, these requirements are going to extend to companies that are already reporting companies, or companies that are filing an S1 registration statement to become a reporting company. And that's the extent of the application of the proposed rules.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Our next question comes from David Jaber, founder of Climate Positive Consulting. And David asks, to what extent has the SEC looked at harmonizing and/or leveraging the voluntary greenhouse gas emission standards and platforms that have been in place for years and have a high level of business community engagement?
Thanks for that question. And as I noted in my introductory remarks, much of the disclosure framework that the SEC proposed is based on the TCFD framework and the GHG emissions disclosure framework. So we wanted to leverage and incorporate and build on those frameworks that are familiar to investors and they're familiar to companies, and that both companies and investors agree is a workable framework to the largest extent. So to the extent that we've gotten significant public comments in the request for public input that was put out by Acting Chair Lee, many of the respondents, many of the commenters recommended that we look to both the GHG emissions framework and also TCFD. So we're building on those frameworks. We didn't incorporate them wholesale, but the methodology and the vocabulary are familiar, as I said, both to investors and to companies. And we also take note, of course, that international standards, international organizations are also building on the TCFD and GHG emissions framework. And so there's a hope, at least, that there will be at some point some convergence with respect to US standards and standards around the world.
Wonderful, thank you. Our next question comes from Jackie Beebe, and Jackie's question is, how does being a B Corp or utilizing certified B Corps in your supply chain change how you report on ESG to the SEC?
Well, that's a very interesting question. And I guess the answer is that the proposed rules are going to apply to all registrants, regardless of their corporate form or the corporate form of their suppliers. So we did get some comments from B corporations in response to the request for public input from Acting Chair Lee, which I just mentioned. And we hope and we encourage B corporations to also comment and respond to the current proposal.
Great. We have some other questions that have also come up at ASBN.
Okay.
Ask.
Sure.
Thank you. What other policymakers and stakeholders should ASBN engage to help support the proposed climate-related disclosures?
Well, that's a great question, and we want to hear, and Chair Gensler spoke yesterday, and he also said we want to hear from all investors, institutional investors and retail investors. We welcome comments from all stakeholders, companies, investors, institutional, individual, as I mentioned, retail investors, from advocacy groups, from asset managers, and also from academics. So we feel like different perspectives on the proposals and on the request for comments will be very helpful to us at the commission. So I guess, again, we really encourage investors from all walks of life and companies and academics and other observers to comment. And again, to comment on all aspects of the proposals, or those aspects of the proposals that are especially important to those groups.
Great. And what are your thoughts on greenwashing, and what other actions and policy areas is the SEC considering around protecting investors from fraudulent ESG claims?
Well, we're well aware of greenwashing concerns, and we have questions, requests for comment about concerns about greenwashing in the proposal. We think that requiring kind of comparable, consistent, and reliable disclosure with very clear standards around that disclosure, including with respect to greenhouse gas emissions, a phased-in assurance requirement for at least for scopes 1 and scopes 2 emission will go very far in ensuring that disclosures, the claims that companies are making regarding their record with respect to the climate, on climate change and climate related risks are reliable. So that's very important to us. And we really hope that, part of course, the purpose behind this rule is to make sure that we're getting more standardized and more reliable information. But we've also been taking steps within the commission for the past year or so to address concerns about greenwashing, including establishing a climate task force, which includes representatives from various divisions across the commission. And in the fall, the Division of Corporation Finance issued comment letters specifically focused on climate related disclosure. And we posted a Dear Issuer letter that provides sample comments, examples of comments that we might issue in the course of those reviews. And that Dear Issuer letter is available. It really is focused on compliance with the 2010 guidance that I mentioned in my introductory remarks. And again, we're encouraging companies, even companies that didn't receive this comment letter, to take a close look at the Dear Issuer letter, and again, to assure that their disclosure based on the current requirements, not the requirements that are being proposed right now, but the existing requirements, to make sure that the disclosure measures up and meets the standards of those requirements. So those are just some examples of the attention that SEC is applying to greenwashing concerns. And again, if companies making claims that are inaccurate, whether it's about ESG issues or other issues, we're gonna comment if we become aware of it, and if we're not satisfied with the response, there's a possibility of a reference or referral to enforcement.
Thank you so much. Why is including Scope 3 emissions and disclosure requirements important for investors?
Well, that's a really good question. I'll just go back to sort of my initial statement, which is that for some companies and in some industries, Scope 3 emissions represents the majority of a company's emissions, or the majority of the emissions for many companies within those industries. So if Scope 3 is the majority of the emissions, and we're sort of moving towards a low carbon economy, where because of, again, possible regulatory changes, changes in counterparties' preferences, changes in investors' concerns for consumer demand, right? If the majority of those emissions are Scope 3, investors really need to get a sense of those Scope 3 emissions in order to assess a company's preparedness for that transition to a low carbon economy. So without the Scope 3 emissions, it would be very difficult to assess a company's carbon footprint, and then therefore to assess whether it's well prepared or how it is preparing for, again, the transition to a lower carbon economy. And again, I gave that example. Oil and gas is one example of an area where Scope 3 is going to be most likely to be very significant to investors. And then I think another area is, as I already mentioned, the automobile manufacturing.
Yes. And in terms of defining materiality, could we be successful in arguing that these Scope 3 requirements are important to the decision-making of a reasonable investor?
Yeah, well, of course, as I mentioned, the reasonable investor standard is the standard by which that courts have applied and the SEC applies in assessing materiality. And it's the basic test, whether the information would be important to the reasonable investor when making an investment or a voting decision. The materiality determination is basically depends on facts and circumstances. So, it's up to the company initially to make that determination. But of course, investors, to the extent that investors are able to argue convincingly that that information is important and demonstrate, again, either to the court or the SEC to demonstrate to a court that that information is important, then yes, that will have an impact. So the perspective of investors is important in that materiality determination. I guess I would just summarize by saying that, but that it's the reasonable investor. And again, it's going to depend on the facts and circumstances and the total mix of information. But certainly, the investor needs, for the examples I just discussed, are going to be the most significant factor in that materiality determination. So we can't say, right now, yes, this is definitely material, but we can point to the factors that would be important in consideration in certain scenarios where the information would be deemed to be material.
Great. And I know you have a very demanding schedule. Do you have time for a couple additional questions?
Of course, of course.
Thank you. Why are you providing a liability safe harbor for Scope 3?
Why are we providing a liability safe harbor for Scope 3? Well, I guess I would start by saying we want to provide incentives, create incentives for companies to provide this information, especially to the extent that the information is important to investors. The second thing I would say is that, as I said, the Commission has acknowledged that the Scope 3 methodology is not as developed as the methodology for Scopes 1 and 2 emissions. And thirdly, I would say that, we acknowledge that to a large extent, the information about Scope 3 emissions is outside of the control of the company. So that's to a large extent, they're relying on third-party data. And that relying on that third-party data creates risks, potential liability risks. So we heard from companies that they're very concerned about the liability risk, and that creates a disincentive for the Scope 3 disclosure. So we want to address that concern by creating a safe harbor, which will hopefully encourage more robust disclosure of Scopes 3. I do want to make sure that I mention that the safe harbor is not a blank check, that there are important conditions in the safe harbor to, again, protect the reliability of that information, to assure that the information that's being provided under scope 3, even with this liability safe harbor, is still going to be reliable and thus useful to investors. So the scope 3 safe harbor, liability safe harbor for scope 3 emissions will only apply, that is, companies will only benefit from that if the disclosures have a reasonable basis and if they're made in good faith. So if you make a good faith attempt to provide that disclosure and there's a reasonable basis for the disclosure, the companies will be protected from liability. So like, as I said, it's not a blank check, but hopefully, we're concerned about, there was a lot of concern expressed about the costs of doing the scope 3 emissions disclosure. And this is an attempt to mitigate some of those costs and the liability concerns.
Got it. Thank you so much. And to dovetail off of that, why aren't you making scope 3 mandatory for all issuers? Why are SRCs exempt from scope 3 disclosure?
Right. So again, it's the concern about balancing costs with the benefit to investors. And for the larger companies, first of all, that information is more important to investors. A lot of the larger companies are already making those disclosures, so they're comfortable and familiar with the disclosure framework. And then for the larger company or the largest companies, they can spread the cost of the disclosure over sort of a broader footprint of their operations. For the smaller reporting companies, since they're smaller, the cost of compliance with the GHG emissions disclosure requirements would be, proportionately larger. And so again, there was just a real focus on the needs of investors and balancing those needs against the cost to the companies. And the decision is made that with respect to the smaller reporting companies, at least initially. And again, of course, we welcome comments. So we'd like to hear from companies and from investors about this calculation. But that at least with respect to the smallest reporting companies, the cost would be more significant, and that was part of the decision-making factor.
Got it. Thank you so much. And I know you have another engagement. So in closing, on behalf of ASBN, we'd like to thank Director Jones for her valuable time and sharing her insightful perspectives with us. And thank you all who took the time to join us on this webinar today. As mentioned earlier, ASBN has a corporate transparency and ESG disclosure working group, and we encourage all who are interested to join. We also encourage all who wish to do so to take impactful action and sign on to the statement to support the SEC climate disclosure proposal and add any further comments. We're most grateful for your participation today and look forward to continuing to work with you to advocate for solutions and policies that support an equitable, sustainable, and stakeholder economy. Thank you again, Director Jones, and to all who joined today's webinar. Goodbye.
Thank you for having me. Bye.
Thank you.